Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wells. Nice to see you all today. For a lot of you, you're used to this. You've been remote students since the beginning of the quarter, used to these videos. For some of you, my in-person students are going remote for the next 2 weeks. This will be your first video. But today, we're going to be reading The Monkey's Paw. It's a short story by W. Jacobs, and it's in the horror genre. It is a sort of a scary or suspenseful story. And I want you to get out your notes, the Thrill of Horror ELA guided notes that we started working on in class or that you've seen posted in Google Classroom. And we're going to be filling part of that out today as we read it. Also on Google Classroom, you'll see posted the story. I want you to read it along with me as I'm reading it. And we'll stop from time to time to kind of talk about a few things and take some notes. This story is more than one part, and I am going to release the video in more than one part. So there'll be more than one video to watch for this story. So I can't remember now if there's 2 parts or 3 parts here, but it'll either be 2 or 3 videos, and this is the first of those videos. So let's go ahead and start reading together. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, put his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. So right in this very first paragraph, we want to stop, and I want you to write down the definition of a word on your notes. And the word is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when the author gives a hint at what will happen later in the story. When the author gives clues that hint at what will happen later in the story, that's called foreshadowing. So you'll want to write that on your notes. And right here at the beginning of the story, we have an example of foreshadowing. Now we know that this, like I said, is a horror story. It's a scary story. But what's he talk about? Well, the father and son are playing chess, and the father puts his king in, which is a chess piece in the game, into sharp and unnecessary peril, meaning danger, unnecessary danger. And so this is actually foreshadowing. Maybe later on in the story, it won't be just the chess pieces that are in danger, but it'll be the humans, the characters in the story. Well, let's keep on reading. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with a sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses and the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and the heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook his hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host brought out drinks and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. He began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. Now I want you to look at that paragraph I just read there for a moment. Do you see any foreshadowing there? Any clues the author is giving you? Well, we've got this soldier sergeant major coming to visit his friend, and he's telling stories about things that he experienced in the army, about the foreign lands that he visited, brave deeds, and strange peoples, wars, plagues. And so as he's telling these stories, you're thinking, these are strange and exciting things. Maybe something strange and exciting is going to happen in this story. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. And when he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken my charms, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something? Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that three separate men could each have three wishes from it. All right, so as we're looking at this also tells us something about what's called theme. You'll see that in your notes, theme. And you want to write the definition down. A theme is a message about life or human nature that the writer wants to share with readers. The theme is a message about life or human nature that the writer wants to share with readers. So as we're thinking about it, what would the theme be? Well, he pretty well spells it out for you right here. He says he got this little monkey's paw, a little hand off of a dead monkey that's sort of mummified, and he says this holy man from India put a spell on it because he wanted to show that fate controlled people. Fate ruled people's lives. Fate is sort of that power that many people think exists that determines what you're going to do and what you're going to not do. It controls your life. And this man wanted to show people that, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. So if you try to change things, if you try to mess with the future, if you try to change the course of events, then bad things are going to happen to you if you try to go against fate. And so that's part of the theme of the story here is what is the fate is. Now, the other thing, this theme is about human nature too. I wonder if it's in human nature. It's just part of our nature to try to change things, to try to change fate. And will we be unsuccessful at it when we do? Well, that's what we're talking about theme. We're talking about theme here. So he put a spell on it so that three separate men could each have three wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have three, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the three wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his three wishes. Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first two were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your three wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man. What do you keep it for? Okay, Do you notice any foreshadowing here, too? Read this paragraph again, the one that starts with the first man had his three wishes. Well, if you said that, the first man who wished died, that could be foreshadowing. Is something really bad going to happen? Someone else who makes a wish? Another one, when we get down to the next paragraph here, it'll say this little monkey's paw had already caused enough mischief already. How could the little hand of a dead monkey cause mischief? Well, that could be some foreshadowing too. Soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another three wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? So, as we're thinking about the theme of the story, another thing that we want to think about in terms of theme is some themes are what are called a universal theme. A universal theme, and that's a theme. It's in your notes, so you want to put that down. It's a theme found in literature of different cultures and time periods. Mrs. White here mentions the Arabian Nights. This is a story from the Middle East from about 1,000 years ago. Actually, several stories. If you have heard of Aladdin or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, those are both stories from the Arabian Nights. And a lot of their themes in those stories keep popping up later on. And we see that in a lot of fairy tales. We see that in a lot of legends and even scary stories that the themes happen over and over again. And so we call them universal themes. And they're universal, like meaning complete and whole, because they affect everybody. They address all of humanity, all people. Okay? But when we see them from a bunch of different cultures and time periods, we call those themes universal themes. Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all three burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. Seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then, and that'll just do it. His father smiled shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man, distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night. Something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, snatching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. This very last paragraph here uses what we call imagery. Many times authors use vivid imagery to make a point. Imagery, and I think this is in your notes, you'll want to write it down. Imagery is descriptive language that appeals to the senses. Descriptive language that appeals to the senses. He sat alone in the fire and he could see faces in the fire, and he saw this face that was a face of a simian, monkey, or ape-like face, and it made him think of that monkey's paw. So this is an example of some really vivid imagery. Okay, in the next video, we're going to watch part 2, see what happens then. So be sure to watch part 2. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video and enable your notifications so you can see all of my great and wonderful videos. Talk to you later. Have a great day.